So hi everyone, those of you who are on the call, who will be joining the call, and also those of you who will be listening into the call. I think we had a number of people registered who haven't yet arrived. So if you're listening in, just imagine you're here with us in that time and space. Today we have our community webinar. I've been really looking forward to this one. It's around creating a developmental rhythm. And I'd like to explore this with you from a number of perspectives today. One of those perspectives is how do we actually embed a developmental rhythm within our organisational life and our team lives within organisations, but also how might we do that as individuals and even as communities. And so today, just from a logistical perspective, again, I am going to invite you all to stay on mute unless you decide to say something, in which case just take yourself off mute. Any questions or perspectives in the chat box? And let me know if there's any IT challenges, and we might use some breakout rooms if some more people join us. Otherwise, we might just treat this as one big breakout room and have some discussions as we go through. So I thought to start off with, it could be quite useful to discuss what we actually mean by development, because I think we're increasingly using terms to describe things, and we believe somewhat naively often that other people assume that the same thing that we assume when we use the term. However, I think it's really important that when we do use language, we understand what is meant by that language. So in our context, and by that context I mean adaptive cultures, development is about not just skill development, it's not just developing the capabilities to do your work or or have a functional life. It's about building the capacities that we need in order to be able to adapt and evolve continuously, and not as parts of a human being, but as a whole human being. And from an organisational perspective, this is about building adaptive capacity collectively in a way that helps us to evolve, certainly as whole human beings, even within that context, but also as whole communities and whole organisations and then broader systems and societies as well. So adaptive capacity is a word that's increasingly bandied about in all kinds of areas, whether it comes from, urban development policy to the environment to leadership and business. And I think it's really important for us to continue to orient to why it's so important to build adaptive capacity. It is important so that we can adapt, grow, thrive, and sometimes also so that we are able to survive, that we're able to influence in greater complexity as well as leaders and human beings. So with the world becoming more complex, how can we, rather than be subject to that complexity and overwhelmed by that complexity, be someone who can have agency within that and have some level of influence? Adaptive capacity is also something that is really important if we're wanting to be able to have more agency in the way our world evolves. What we do know is that it's a very small percentage of human beings and a very small percentage of leaders, including of our largest institutions and organisations, that currently have the capacity to enable systemic and evolutionary transformation. So while there are so many transformation programs going on in just about every organisation at the moment, the capacity of the people who are executing on those or leading those or even thinking about those is much lower than what their aims are in terms of those transformation programs. So there are a few things that for me make adaptive capacity one of the most important things that we build over the next period of time, if indeed we're able to survive as a human race intact and thriving over the next 50 to 100 years. Developmental rhythm is something I've become increasingly curious about over the last decade, and it's something that I've seen as fundamental to the success of any of our adaptive cultures projects. So when we look at developmental rhythm in a lot of organisations, it's still very flatline, very basic, and it's very much a process and systems thing around, getting your development plan in every year. Unfortunately, there's so much performance calibration that still goes on, and people mainly know that it's incredibly flawed, but they haven't found another way to trust in the ability of human beings to grow and develop. So we really need to fundamentally look at that. I don't know that we have necessarily any answers, but there are some cues and clues that we have learned over the last 10 years, and I'd like to share some principles around those with you today. What I see developmental rhythm as is a way to embed core rituals that support development and evolution into the rhythm of an individual or community's life, or into the workflow of an organisation. And some of the things that I've seen as absolutely fundamental to those rituals is that they incorporate reflection and learning, that they do include stretch experiences that help people to gain knowledge and wisdom over time doing real work, and that there is also an element of support or developmental relationship in there. And those relationships could be from a mentor or a supervisor, they could be from peers, they could just be from the relationship of everyone in the organisation. And we see that shift and change through the different stages of cultural evolution. Another fundamental piece that I'd just like to bring into the discussion early today is about the difference between ritual and habit, and how easily beautifully crafted rituals can quickly descend into something that's very habitual. I'd like to just pause there and invite the people on the call today to take yourself off mute if you've got something to share, or put something in the group chat. What do you believe is the difference between ritual and habit?
Hi, Alison.
Hi there. Hi, Vanessa.
Habit feels more like you've got to do it.
Yes.
With ritual, something about more kind of giving to yourself to.
Okay, so it's more of yourself in the ritual.
Yeah.
Rather than something that's imposed.
Yes.
Or
yeah.
And it's Terry here. I'd also add that for me, a habit is something that you almost do mindlessly,
yes,
whereas a ritual is something you do mindfully, or at the very least with intent.
Yes, with intent and presence. And I think Georgina's has written as well that, ritual is a more mindful experience. Is there anyone else that would like to add a perspective? Yvonne? I'm not going to force people to come into the space just in case they're listening as they're doing something else as well. Alex? All right, we'll pause there. Oh, thanks, Yvonne. There's something sacred about rituals, exactly. And I think a lot of the sacredness that we used to have in our daily life when we were less busy has certainly come out of our life in such a challenging way. And so it can become increasingly difficult for us as human beings to find that sense of sacred. And my sense has always been that when that sacredness is not in what we're doing, whether it's our family life, whether it's our work, whether it's our organisations, whether it's our friendships, whether it's our relationship with ourselves, that we do, in a sense, operate quite mindlessly. And therefore we're swept along with life rather than being able to act upon or have a reciprocal participation with life. Alex has just shared, I think rituals are linked to some archetypal human aspect, not sure habits are. Absolutely. So look, habits aren't necessarily bad, but they should be those things that we can do unconsciously, rather than the things that we need to bring that ongoing learning, presence and reflection into. And so I'd love us to hold this idea as we move through the webinar today, that we're not talking about habits, we're talking about bringing sacredness and ritual into the way that we work in organisations and in the way we relate to ourselves and our communities. When I've seen this happen, truly miracles can occur. And the sacredness is not necessarily something religious or something overly spiritual. It's about bringing more of the human being into what we're talking about, more truth, more integrity, more courage, more bravery, as you shared earlier, Georgina, into our spaces of work and into our spaces of life. So I'd love to open up a conversation now, and just very briefly, I'd love each person to share either on the chat or taking yourself off mute, what is your current developmental rhythm? And you might have a developmental rhythm that supports you, that you do on your own. You might have something that you do with some supportive developmental relationships or in your organisation. But I'd love to hear how your development is currently being supported and enabled. So as people are thinking about whether to take themselves off mute or write in the chat box. So certainly the adaptive cultures community and relationships in our team developmentally supportive. I also speak to a supervisor at least twice a week. I've been doing that in some way, shape or form for, I'd say, 25 years, not with the same person, but ongoing. And I have daily reflective practice, which I'm very, very sacred about. So Yvonne, you've spoken about regular buddy catch-ups and reflection. Andrew, you use journaling. Anything else anyone's doing? Or anyone who says, gee, I really haven't considered this, that's fine as well. Take yourself off mute. I really need to refocus on my own development and how that works.
Terry here. I try very hard and mostly succeed, but not always, to actually block time in my calendar to do some reflection, because I'm very aware of my own limitations. And if I'm not structured around it, it often doesn't happen.
Yes.
For me, it's the reflection and the ongoing focus on my ITC maps. That's probably the methodology that I use to drive my development. But I find if I don't consciously schedule the time, it falls aside, it falls by the wayside.
Yes, and there's something about time and ritual that's really important. And if you look back through, I guess, if you look at from an archetypal perspective, and Alex, you brought this into the conversation earlier, you know, that time in terms of the change of the season, in terms of the time of the day, in terms of, you know, the stage of our development of ourselves and our children and our families is really important. Alex uses daily conversations. Awesome. Yvonne's got some train time happening. Andrew's mentioned the need to find joy in daily practices, so he looks forward to them rather than finding them as a chore. And oh, wonderful, Alex, I love that in terms of the 2-hour coffee, and you're very welcome joining us a little bit late. So whatever our developmental rhythm is, I think it's really important to realise that we do need to bring continual presence to it and actively find joy in it. I really like that, Andrew, because so often it may not necessarily be a joyous moment or a completely happy moment that we have looking at ourselves in the mirror or facing some of the challenges in our organisation. But how can we find joy even in the discomfort would be something that I'd invite us to question today, and also to question in organisational life. So often I see people in teams and in organisations avoiding it because it's not easy. And so developmental practice shouldn't necessarily be easy, but we do need to be able to find that joy, joy in the practice of it. We have, in most organisations that are compliant dependent towards achievement culture, at the very least, some level of operational rhythm in terms of the way we meet, how regularly, who's there, and some way to kind of keep the organisation moving and flowing. What we don't have a lot of is developmental rhythms, and when there are developmental rhythms, they're not particularly intentional and they're not particularly emergent. But in the same way that we look at operational rhythms, we also need to look at developmental rhythms from why are we doing it? What is it? What are we talking about? You know, what is the intent? Who's involved? How are we going to run this process? And also have time. So whether it's on the train or whether it's in a team meeting or whether it's scheduled reflection time, what is the duration? What is the frequency? And how do we integrate the insights or the work that we do developmentally into our daily world? And for me, this is one reason why a lot of the deeper development work doesn't get picked up by organisations. It's because people seem to segregate business work or operational work or even strategic work sometimes from the development work of individuals. And as practitioners, my sense is that that's the work that we have to do, is helping people to find the integrations and helping people to see that it's all one. When that has happened in organisations, we've seen an incredible pickup in terms of people's engagement in developmental rhythms and commitment to that as well. I thought I'd share this with you today as a kind of cute cartoon around what often happens in any developmental practice, whether it's a team, organisational or individual one, is that we have some sacred space and time, we have our ritual, and then we get back out into the world. And I think that lack of integration between the development work and the quote unquote application of that work in what a lot of people call real work. I believe developmental work is real work too. There's a real gap there. There's a lack of integration, and therefore we come back into our life and all of that great stuff, the things that we knew to be true, the common sense that we arrived at, and the insights go out the window. So how are we finding plans and bridges and anchors from one world, being the world of whatever the ritual is, into our daily life, and how are we keeping that ritual alive, if you like, on a moment-to-moment basis is another question I think we need to keep asking ourselves. So I can hear some insights and questions coming through already on the chat. We've got from Terry, getting on the balcony can help her find joy when she's finding it not particularly joyful in and of itself. Alex is sharing the theme around environment or context as being an important rhythm. Absolutely. And from that perspective, Alex, it may not be exactly what you were meaning, but a lot of, I think, consultants or people and culture people come in and try to impose a developmental rhythm on an organisation. And from our experience, what's really important is to find a way that this is going to work within the rhythm that's already there in the organisation. We might choose to change the overall rhythm of the organisation over time, but that's a very long-term trend. It takes a long time to shift culture. It takes equally long time often to shift those deep rhythms that exist within the business. And so therefore, how are we going to bring some rituals, bring some developmental practice into a system in a way that's going to work with what currently exists is incredibly important. Georgina says that she's working on a personal strength around conditioning training. That's fabulous. And focusing on the areas of weakness and building strength to enable greater overall functionality. Lovely. So I can see a lot of those insights coming through. I'd just love some people to come off mute and share any challenges that they've had in terms of implementing developmental practice and rhythm, and any questions you have. And that's just going to give me a context of where we go, as I'd like to now share some frameworks and principles that are going to be useful in helping us to bridge the gap between what we currently have and that deeper level of developmental rhythm. Any questions or challenges you've noticed in organisations?
It's Terry here, Alison. Something just resonated with me when you were talking about, sometimes as practitioners we try and impose a rhythm on our organisation, and that's not always successful. In my experience, there sometimes needs to be a balance between maybe not imposition, but recommendation. Yes. or providing people with some guidance, because often they've got no idea.
Absolutely.
And I think it would be really interesting to hear from you or other people is how do we find that balance between taking on a little bit of the monkey and the responsibility for building those rhythms, but also giving the work back to the people, because that really is a challenge for me in many circumstances.
It's such a great point, Terry, and I think the least that I've seen work for any organisation is to spend some solid time on developmental rhythm once every month or once every 6 weeks. Ideally, you're bringing elements of that into all of your conversations and all of your meetings and all of your initiatives. However, that solid block of time is also, I think Andrew said, there's a daily practice he has, but also immersion. And those immersive experiences can help us to make the most of how do we now do the next level of work in our daily work and daily operations. And it's interesting you say that level of guidance, because I've been reflecting lately that, my sense is I'm going to draw up some new criteria for how I work with clients. And that's going to be one of my criteria, that if you bring me in, you need to be committed to at least every 6 weeks with me or without me doing some immersion in a developmental rhythm type flow. Does anyone else have any perspectives or experiences, questions or challenges to share?
Ellie, it's Andrew. The question that comes up for me listening into the potential for rhythm is around discipline, and I'd love to hear your perspective or thoughts around how in the face of the magnitude of interruptions of life, of disruption, of organisations moving around, reprioritisation, deprioritising potentially of development sometimes, how, from your perspective, organisations and individuals can build a level of discipline or a discipline to continue that going?
Such a pertinent question, Andrew, given my week, where I've had a few different experiences of that and some real challenges with some of my clients in that space. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen, this is answering the how can we, is that a lot of the aspects or parts of organisations that are wanting to do this work are not operating in a vacuum, and that even if one part of a system is more evolved in these practices, there can be other parts of the system that put a lot of pressure on them. Whether that is that the senior leadership team isn't as on board as other parts of the organisation, whether it is that other parts of the system are demanding people attend certain meetings and therefore pulling them out of their own flow. I think it's a really, really useful question. And for me, disciplines are just a part of it. I think there needs to be a probably long-term approach to helping people to understand and push back and have courage and bravery in pushing back around all of the things that might get in the way. Alex has said the role of facilitator in holding the learning or group. It's important there's a handover process to the group appropriate to their level of development. It's so true. Yeah, where's the funding for the external help to keep things going on? And there's been a couple of experiences I've had over the last few months where I've come into a client that I have not worked with in the same way for a period of time, and I've absolutely seen that step back into the ways of being in the past. So how do you actually have someone of a high enough level of consciousness holding the space in the organisation? And I think that's really where Andrew and I started to become committed to this idea of the accreditation process, because we need more people within systems to be able to hold that rather than just having the external help doing that over time. Anyone else have any questions or perspectives? I can see Yvonne saying, how do you make it sustainable and keep it fresh? Yvonne, from your experience, is there anything that you would share?
Hi there, Alison. For us, it's getting easier because we're on our third round of doing this, and we've been having monthly coaching sessions, and we've encouraged people to get together in buddies and sort out for themselves how they want to run it and what they want to focus on. But we have said very clearly to them, if you do this, you will be more successful. And that's speaking from prior experience. I think it's really important that you hold people to the work that they've signed up for. So in the beginning, I see that as my role as a facilitator to do that, and then I try to more transfer that role over to the group so that they start to coach each other, and I step away more and more, and I tell them that this is part of the learning process, that they learn to carry that themselves. So there is an opportunity to practice the skills in the room and they learn from each other. So I think it's a combination of being really holding people accountable at the start so they know where the bar is.
Yeah.
and then giving them as rich a learning experience as possible throughout the sessions, and having something to work towards that you check in with progress on a regular basis as well. I found that sometimes people made massive progress but didn't even notice how far they'd come.
Exactly.
And to stop in somewhere and say, hey, remember where you came from?
Yes.
And now you're here. That's massive. And that's not something people often see themselves. So that's a bit of a motivation in itself to keep going. So that's
great perspectives there, Yvonne. And I think I'll just draw attention also to what you said at the beginning. It's easier now, it's on our third round, and part of that is critical mass.
Yes.
So when you look at most human beings haven't really, they've given away their personal agency, or they've had their personal agency being taken away from them. And when they're mixing with a whole other bunch of people who feel like they've got no personal agency, it just really reinforces that narrative. But as soon as they're able to see examples of other people in the system being able to take and hold that agency and act on it, it really creates that permission and that open space and boundary. And therefore, those strong teams that we really invest in to be able to hold a new archetype, if you like, or a new image for the organisation of what could be possible can be really important. And also often difficult to actually get people realising how powerful that can be and how catalytic for the entire system. There are a few frameworks that we've found really useful in helping people to explore what rituals would be useful for them at any stage of development in building greater adaptive capacity, whether that's as individuals or collectives. And I'd like to share a few with you. And if you have a pen and paper or something nearby, you might like to pick that up and consider what's going to be most useful for me in this conversation. Am I here mainly to reflect on my own individual development and maybe use that as the context through which I'm listening? Am I looking at this through a team or an organisational perspective, or am I looking at it through all of those lenses? And then maybe just take some notes of things that you can integrate or implement or continue to reflect on post the webinar. Of course, the stages of cultural evolution can be incredibly useful in looking at what are the appropriate rituals that you might like to bring into a system. And I think one of the things that I've learned is the challenge of bringing rituals that might be of a stage of development that is too far for an organisation to reach into. And it was interesting, I was talking to a leader that I'll be working with her and her team next week. And my sense of the system is it's in chaos. There's a huge amount of stress happening at the moment. And we spoke today about throwing out a lot of our agenda for the meeting next week and just creating a space for people to breathe. And so I think what's really important is to understand the context and what's happening in at a given point in time, and therefore what are the foundations that need to be built in order for the great work to be done. How can we, for example, next week, provide enough breathing space that people can move out of reactivity and into a more responsible way of thinking about the things that they might need to think and talk about. So when we look at our stages of cultural evolution framework and consider the different rituals that might come to life at each stage, I'd love to have people write in the chat box or take yourself off mute and share what are the rituals that you think would be useful to move from one stage of evolution to the next. So does anyone like to share what they think would be a useful ritual or a developmental practice to implement on the road from impulse-oriented to compliant-dependent culture? And if no one speaks up, I'll share some ideas to get us started, then perhaps people can add more into the group chat. So yes, something with regularity, Yvonne. Absolutely. So just bringing some sense of rhythm into this system is incredibly important. Anything that's consistent, anything that helps people to reflect, pause, slow down even for a minute, anything that can help people to, yes, Terry, structure, align, become slightly more cohesive, provide some clarity, Andrew, thank you, provide some comfort. Also sharing power, so some rituals around sharing power and information. These organisations can at times become very tribal. So there are some rituals that we can use which help people to look at power and understand power and systems and then learn to share that over time. How about from compliant dependent to achievement culture? I'd love to hear if anyone has any sense of some rituals that might be useful. Celebrating success, absolutely. I think that's something we could probably do more of at each stage and continue as a ritual right the way through. Some of the things that we've found really important at compliant dependent to achievement to ritualise are ritualising the identification and removal of unnecessary barriers to speed, ease and agility in the system. So what you often get at compliant dependence is a whole lot of complaints. Everyone knows what's slowing them down, but no one's actually setting down and having a ritual of identification and then a ritual of removal and perhaps celebration. That can be incredibly powerful. Yes, Yvonne, those longer term period goals could be really useful. Any accountability and ownership rituals, or rituals that enable personal agency or greater self-awareness, can be incredibly useful. Rituals around independent judgment and perspective. Rituals around sharing leadership can be really useful here and at the next stage. And how do we celebrate self-authorship can be incredibly useful. So rituals of celebrating people actually step into some of those self-authoring qualities and milestones. Alex, great, recognising opportunities to provide problems and solutions in forums. Absolutely, so anything in terms of you getting more people speaking up and being heard, and those personal development rhythms, absolutely. And then from achievement to collaborative growth, would anyone like to jump in and add something to the chat? Yeah, fabulous. So those peer-to-peer buddy rituals have been really profound. I think, Yvonne, probably in your organisation, that's something you mentioned earlier that's been incredibly useful and help people to take that next level of ownership as well. Rituals around team events and growth, absolutely. And at collaborative growth, those cross-functional decision-making and dialogue rituals can be incredibly important. Post-implementation reviews, absolutely. So continual learning rituals. Perspective taking rituals become more important, and not just perspective taking within the team that you're in, but more broadly in the organisation, and then external as well. Starting to be able to think in broader systems and having whole people conversations. Challenge, sometimes what can be really useful is such a shift in language from achievement culture to collaborative growth culture. We can even have rituals around language changing or language challenging, moving from seeing people as resources or parts into seeing them as whole people. Yes, the visuals and aesthetics in workplace design can be a ritual in and of themselves, depending on how they're used and explored, and the conversations we have around them, and recognition for helping others. And then as we move beyond collaborative growth towards co-creation, are there any rituals that people can think of that would be incredibly important? At collaborative growth, we start to have rituals around disruption. Absolutely, Andrew. Active disruption rituals, creation and destruction rituals come in there. So up until collaborative growth, there's this kind of, we're trying to preserve something, right? Whether we're trying to preserve, our structure, processes, policies, the ways we've always done things. We're trying to preserve exactly the way we can, continue to be competitive and kind of extract value from the market at collaborative growth. Often we're trying to preserve our culture, and who we are. And then, how do we continue to disrupt the things that we're trying to preserve, to see how they might be limiting us, see what we do need to bring with us and evolve, and the things that we can actually actively ritualize the destruction of. Use of stories at each level, absolutely, coming into that archetypal angle. And this is the way we can start to also have anchoring rituals that start to bridge from one stage of evolution to the other. Listening to the future and presencing rituals become increasingly important, and inviting the outside in rituals in terms of starting with customers, probably at achievement culture, and then moving towards wider groups, wider systems, and really bringing those perspectives in. They might be perspectives that don't yet exist. So as we move towards co-creation, we're really starting to invite more of those perspectives from the future and the perspectives that perhaps aren't present yet. So the adaptive cultures framework can be a really useful talking tool once people have developed an understanding of where they're going as a team, an individual, or an organisation, and where they currently are from a cultural evolution perspective, to be able to look at what are the rituals that are going to take us that next step, that are really going to develop us. If we go too far too fast, often people end up feeling incredibly demoralised and like the stretch is just too much. But if we keep that idea of maximum stretch there, but help them to embed rituals that are going to naturally help them to flow towards that, again, very surprising things can happen. And Yvonne, as you said, we can then look back and say, wow, we've actually come incredibly far. We didn't realise because it was ritualised and ongoing, but we've made some incredible shifts. Andrew, absolutely. What are the perspectives from the edge that we're hearing? And that edge continues to get wider and wider as we evolve our culture. The other framework that can be really useful in helping people to self-diagnose the rituals and development rhythm for them is using the self-authoring star. And I believe everyone on the call would have come across this in some way, shape or form. And these are some of the key attributes of self-authorship or personal agency that we see being invited in individuals and collectives. So spending some time with each of these elements and looking at what is it that we need most right now in order to take us that next step, and to help us to evolve as a team or as an organisation or collective. And then what are the rituals that we can embed into our developmental rhythm that would support those? So do we need some perspective taking rituals? Are they the most important thing? Are we yet oriented to purpose? Do we first need to spend some time really sensing into the externals around our system and understanding what our purpose might be? Really connecting back to the essence of the organisation and why we exist can be an incredibly important ritual. And then continuing to come back to the self-authoring star and revisit it and say, where are we now and what is that next stage of or archetype of self-authorship that we might need to bring in? I'd love to hear from people on the webinar any ideas or insights you have around a ritual that would support those aspects of self-authorship coming into the flow. Anyone at all, Yvonne? So if you're on the chat, you can just write the word, whether it be perspective, and then what is the ritual. And what we can do is we can compile some of these ideas and put it into a little document that people in the community can use then to diagnose what are the rituals that we need to bring into our developmental rhythms. I'll take one being responsibility. I think, you know, rituals around responsibility that aren't about necessarily putting burdens on people so much as talking about how could we be more responsible as individuals and as a collective can be incredibly powerful. So it can even be the ritual of asking a generative question around any of those elements of self-authorship. How might mindfulness be deployed? Yeah. Thanks, Alex. I think there's mindfulness in itself is something that's really important in any of these elements that we've been talking about. And yet on its own, it can turn into sitting on the meditation mat and being incredibly peaceful for 10 minutes, then getting back into the world. I know that mindfulness is a lot more around being present with where you're at, but I think there needs to be a lot more integration into how do we actually bring mindfulness into the discussions we're having in forums and team meetings, and how do we bring self-awareness and care and an orientation to our purpose as we're having those conversations as well. And from my experience, this is a developmental shift rather than something we can necessarily learn. However, all of those techniques can help us. Perspective, Yvonne, you've set a consistent time for ask for perspectives on the team performance from inside and outside. Great. And Teresa's asked, how can we embed rituals into our daily work around these? Thanks, Terry. And so how do you integrate this is so important. And I think what we have noticed is that people that really accelerate this work, it just becomes their way of thinking and being. So that self-authorship star might be at the centre of every conversation in some way. And they're making sure that in whatever they're doing, they're checking with those pieces. Yeah, lovely, Alex. Asking to do mindfulness in a conversation around purpose. What are the reactions internally? Yeah, so those balcony moments are incredibly powerful, and something that we've been using a lot over the last 12 months is not just saying, yes, you have your regular balcony moments, but a number of teams I'm working with actually have a timer that goes halfway through the meeting or the conversation. There's something about that halfway mark where you've still got enough time to correct if it's all gone pear-shaped, or if suddenly you've become unmindful, or you've gone very operational where you're intending to have a strategic conversation, or you haven't been listening to each other. And it gives you the opportunity, if you haven't already had that balcony moment or been mindful, that you can jump back in. So these very simple rituals around the halfway mark, the timer goes off, let's all get on the balcony and observe how the meeting's going. Is there anything we want to course correct? Can also be an incredibly way of building that capacity over time. And then, of course, there becomes less need for course correction as we become more mindful in that flow.
And Alison, just to throw something in there around the mindfulness piece, there's a meeting that we have I think it's every month, it's a global meeting, and the person who chairs the meeting asks us all to sit for 1 minute mindfully to think about the purpose of the meeting in silence. And that's the way we start the meeting, and that's a very ritualistic thing, and it focuses on purpose and also responsibility from the perspective of why are we here and what's our responsibility in this. That's really useful.
It's incredibly powerful. Does anyone else have anything that they've seen has been incredibly powerful as a ritual that brings some more self-authorship into the system? At Adaptive Cultures, we start our team meetings with a check-in, how we are, but we also have a purpose check-in as a part of that. How are we feeling in relation to the Adaptive Cultures purpose, and how are we bringing it to life? And so that's one purpose ritual that we bring into all of our team meetings. The final framework that I'd like to remind us of today is individual, social and structural levers for building adaptive capacity, and making sure that we're taking this into all of our rituals. So even my individual reflection rituals, I'm not just holding the perspective of myself as an individual, but myself as an individual within the systems that I operate. And that in itself is a developmental practice, because I'm continuing to build my systems thinking. I was talking about the ritual of reading news with someone a couple of days ago, and they were saying that they've stopped watching the news because it's so depressing, and they've started just to read the newspapers. And I think that person might be on the call. And I was sharing that, and I didn't realise at the time, but I have a ritual of looking to a number of different news sources from different countries to see what are the different perspectives that those countries' journalists are sharing on a certain issue. And whether any of them are truthful or not, it gives me a real sense of different ways of looking at it. And so in a sense, that's a perspective-taking ritual. So what we've noticed in terms of developmental rhythm is that when the individual development is seen as separate to the social development, seen as separate to the structural development, there tends to be far less traction, less energy and less engagement and less sustainability in that developmental rhythm. Where we've seen this work really well is where we start from the essence of the organisation, the purpose of the organisation, the strategy, the customer need, or something that's actually much bigger than the individual. And then all of the individual work and the teamwork and the social work, of course, there are wonderful things that happen for the individual and team through that process, but it's in service of something greater. And that greater thing is not going to change. And it gives a much greater rationale, if you like, as well, for the need for that work. So my sense is that as adaptive cultures practitioners and as leaders, one of our biggest callings from us at the moment is to be able to help people to create the link between these three aspects of building adaptive capacity and actively build that into the developmental rhythm and the rituals that we bring into organisations. Does anyone have any other questions, reflections or perspectives on that, or any of these three frameworks and how we might use them to support our teams, ourselves, our organisations? Alex has shared, I think when I've heard you preface sessions by attending or showing up in a particular way through a coming conversation really helps. Absolutely. So how do we actually help people to step into their best selves to have the conversation or to do the work can be a really useful ritual as well. Frame, advocate, inform, inquire framework. Love that, Georgina. Lovely. Thank you. So I'd like to spend the last little bit of time just looking at some key principles around developmental rhythm, and feel free to keep typing any questions or perspectives or taking yourself off mute. And I'd love, Andrew, if there's anything you think I've missed here, to shout out and jump in as well, or anyone else, of course. One of the key principles that we've discussed today is creating sacred time and place, and that sacredness speaks to all of the distractions and the other things that might interfere. And so a lot of the challenges is around protecting that time and space. And this is a job in, traditional organisations of the leader of the team or the organisation or the group of people who is committed to this process of bringing a developmental rhythm, they have to be unequivocal in the way that they protect that, that space. Some of the ways to create sacred time and space that we've found really useful in systems where you'll often get landmines or rocks thrown at you when you're trying to do your developmental rhythm is to put more time into the calendar than you need to use. So if there is something that is disruptive that cannot be contained, you still have the time locked in to be able to revisit that. That can be one really useful way of doing that. So you've talked about if people can't find a reason to develop for their own purpose, they might be able to see it's relevant or important for the organisation. Absolutely. And I think Yvonne, you used this, this idea of this is the way to be successful in this organisation, and that's been really powerful. Enabling shifts in state thinking and perceiving, and so many of you have shared whether it's about the way we frame a meeting, whether it's that moment of silence, whether it's bringing mindfulness, rather than just doing a ritual, doing the ritual in a different state of thinking is what makes it a ritual and not a habit. So make sure that you've got some technologies that you're using, and I don't mean computer technologies, or some frameworks or some methods to help people to shift their way of looking at the world. And creating bridges and anchoring realities is the final principle that I felt is really important across all personal, collective or organisational developmental rhythms. So what that means is that often you'll have a team experience a real state shift through their developmental rhythm. You might feel more cohesion, you've got insight, you've got collective intelligence coming together. How do you then anchor that to the reality? And having that conversation while you're still in that state and being really intentional about that, from my perspective, is incredibly important. And I'm going to share with you before we wrap up today a way that we might anchor that reality as an individual, but it can also be used in terms of anchoring collective realities. Are there any other principles that people would like to bring in at this point that they feel are important in implementing developmental rhythms? Okay, great point.
Just one thing from me, Ali, it's Terry here. I touched on it in the chat box. I think, you know, along the lines of the principles of immunity to change, I think you have to have a purpose, like a personal purpose. Why am I doing this? Because if it's not important to you, you're not going to do it.
Yes.
So perhaps some sort of ritual around, you know, recognizing and holding yourself accountable for why this is important for you to build those rhythms.
I love that. Yeah, continuing to reflect on that why. Beautiful. Anyone else like to add anything in? Yeah. I love Andrew's reminder here around the power of just helping people to reflect on themselves with the coaching client who has a manager with high expectations for their development but prioritises short-term goals. So there is a sense of how do we continue to have the conversations around the things that get in the way and what impact that has on the things that we've said are really important. Some of the polarities and synergies that we've already started to talk about in this conversation that are important to address when we're looking at developmental rhythm are action and reflection. While when people have not yet developed any ability to reflect or self-observe, there may be the need for immersive experiences where they learn to be able to do that. And certainly a lot of the work that we do at Adaptive Cultures is around frameworks to help people to become more self-aware and system-aware. But at some point, we need to be able to translate that, and as early as possible, into action, rather than keeping it as a separate practice. Otherwise, what tends to happen is people say, oh, I haven't been able to be strategic, and because, you know, I haven't had my strategic thinking time. And if we would like to develop leaders with the greater capacity to enable systemic transformation, from my perspective, over time, we need to bring people together who not only have that reflective practice, but are able to reflect as they act. And I think Bill Talbot calls that action, the power of action inquiry. Operational and strategic is another really big focus in organisations. It's a big polarity. And again, how do we bring those together so that we're able to have strategic thinking in the way that we act operationally and in the initiatives that we're driving through systems? And the third polarity that I felt to bring up was short and long term. And you evidenced that through your little comment there around the coaching client there, Andrew. And how do we hold the long term as we're acting short term and see the connection? So often when people talk about the present, they're actually talking about the past because they haven't been able to come into the present. They haven't learnt that level of mindfulness or presence in their own worlds. And so therefore, developmental rhythms that help people think with greater future orientation and learn to listen to the future are incredibly powerful to then bring that future into the present and take some of that past pollution out of the present moment. So understanding the way time works, again, I think is a really important capability for us to develop as adaptive cultures practitioners, and to see what time the group is operating within. Disrupting patterns around time is another ritual that can be really useful. Andrew, you've shared intangible equals growth and development and tangible business outcomes. Absolutely. So this is the intangible work I'm doing, and these are the tangible outcomes. And that's where the experimentation is so powerful, in seeing how is my intangible work having an impact on the tangible business outcomes, or is the fact that I'm taking this time to do the intangible work compromising any of those outcomes? And if so, having a conversation around that. Is, yeah, making profit and doing good. Absolutely. And I think they're just two sides of the same coin. Both of them, can be a real polarization, Alex. So thank you for bringing that up. Rather than to bring that synergy together towards being a responsible organisation that can be sustainably successful. Thank you for that. Really appreciate that. Are there any other polarities that people would like to bring in? Looking after your people and looking after society. Yeah, that's a really good one. Thanks, Andrew. And so to wrap up, let's bring this back to individual development and back to ourselves or some of the individuals that we might be supporting, whether they're family members, community members, team members, leaders. And coming back to this framework from Bill Torbett around stages of adult development or action logics. And I'd like to share with you something that I do a lot with the individual leaders that are looking to move into more of that self-transforming and systemic impact space. But it can be used at any space to be able to embed some rituals as an individual, and to make sure those rituals are appropriate to the stage of development, in the same way that we might use the adaptive cultures framework to perceive what is the appropriate ritual for the organisation's or the team's stage of development. So once we've identified what is the action logic that is emergent for us, or what is our aspirational action logic, and for this leader it's a transforming action logic. So this leader is very intent on generating organisational and industry and personal transformations. They have probably moved well beyond achiever and certainly into redefining a number of different areas of the way that they lead. So this is actually one that I've designed with someone that I'm coaching. I have changed it a bit to protect the person. But if you have a look at the second column there, you'll see qualities to embody. And so when I asked him, what are the qualities that you would need to embody? These were the things that he came up with. And you can see it's all about being more strategic, more systemic. He already understands people and their drivers pretty well, but he's looking to more deeply understand those. Look at the whole landscape of the stakeholders that he's working with, etc. And then I invited a reflection on what are the rituals that would enable those qualities to come into being. And you can see some of them are incredibly practical rituals. And so I think often when we think of developmental rhythm, we kind of imagine the meditation mat or, lots of really deep conversations with our co-workers. And that can certainly be part of it, but can also be as practical as visiting another site and learning from some other perspectives and getting a different view of the world. It can be as simple as focusing more on industry forums and relationships. And how do I need to create the space to do that? I need to get other people coming in and working on the leadership and culture. And then the final piece, and I'm using this question more and more in my developmental rhythm work, to orient people towards the future, and it actually orients them more to what the potential of the present is, and pull them out of the past. What is possible? And so for him, it's about transforming the industry and have a larger impact. So to your point, Terry, this is the why or the purpose that helps him to focus on why this developmental rhythm is really important. So they're the key areas that I felt I'd like to share with you today around developmental rhythm. To me, this is something that very few organisations are doing well. And a lot of the case studies that have been written about organisations that are doing it well focus too much on what it looks like rather than the deeper work that has got them there. And I know this after talking to a few of the case studies that have been in Ray Dalio's book or Lulu's book, that what people are probably taking out of those books is too much about the form and not about the, I guess from your perspective, Andrew, what you wrote up, the intangibilities that enable that form to be really powerful. So I thought I'd just end with this question: what are you currently subject to, and what practices or rituals can enable you to become object to those? It's not a question you need to answer, but it's something to leave us with for the rest of the afternoon, and so that we can attend to our own developmental rhythm and perhaps become a little bit more brave, courageous, intentional and wise in the way that we support teams and organisations in bringing deeper developmental rhythms into harmony with the operational rhythms that exist and can exist in our systems. So thanks for being a part of it. Would love to hear any insights, impressions, thoughts, further questions in the chat as we round up. And also feel free to take yourself off mute. Thanks for joining everyone who was on the call. And those of you who are listening after the fact, would love to hear your thoughts, perspectives and comments. Please just write some comments on the webinar portal underneath the recording. We'd love to hear your thoughts and insights.
Just one final comment, Ali, around, you mentioned people focusing a lot on the, what's in the book and the processes that they need to engage in, I guess, for the development. I think that's symptomatic of a lot of the way a lot of organisations work, with anything they're doing, whether it be developmental or any initiatives around cultural transformation. And I'm thinking agile, people think if they put the process in place, they're agile.
Yes.
And I think, if I put a schedule in for development, then I'm developing. And I think a lot of it comes back to that difference between ritual and habit and also purpose. Why am I really doing this?
Yeah, such a great point to close on, Terry. Thank you. All right. Much love to everyone. Enjoy. Would love to hear further follow-up and reflections on the portal. And if you haven't been on the portal for a while, please jump on and share how you're doing, what questions or challenges you have, any articles, books you're reading that you're finding useful, and let's keep the information flowing through our global community. Much love.